A 3-year-old girl in Beirut told her parents she had a different name. She told them where she used to live. She described the house, the street, the neighbors, the specific color of the front door. Her parents had never been to that neighborhood. She had never left their street. She was right about everything. The house existed, the street existed, the neighbors existed. The door was exactly the color she said. The previous occupant of that life had died 14 months before this girl was born. This is the Stevenson Effect, and the reason the scientific world tried to bury it will tell you more about how knowledge actually works than almost anything else you'll ever hear. The Reluctant Believer. In 1960, Ian Stevenson was not a fringe researcher. He was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He had spent his career studying psychosomatic illness, the way the mind produces physical symptoms in the body. He was interested in one specific question that mainstream psychiatry kept sidestepping. Why do some people carry psychological wounds that have no origin in their current lifetime? Patients who had never experienced trauma, describing trauma responses with total precision. Phobias with no triggering event, grief with no identifiable loss. He kept writing the same question in his case notes. Where does this come from? Then, in 1960, a colleague sent him a case file that had no answer inside any framework he had ever been trained in. A 7-year-old boy in India was describing a previous life in specific, verifiable detail. Stevenson read it 3 times, then he booked a flight. The Method. What made Stevenson different from every other researcher who had touched this subject was the same thing that made his findings so difficult to dismiss. He wasn't looking for proof of anything. He was looking for alternative explanations. Every case he investigated, he tried first to explain through fraud, then coaching by parents, then coincidence. Most cases he investigated he eliminated within hours. The ones he couldn't eliminate, he documented with a precision that was almost aggressive. He interviewed the child before anyone took them to verify the claims. He documented the statements in writing before verification. He interviewed the families of both the child and the deceased person separately and compared the accounts. A single case file in the Stevenson archive runs to hundreds of pages. Over 40 years, he personally investigated more than 2,500 cases across 40 countries. The pattern was identical everywhere. The children who had these memories shared a specific profile that Stevenson documented across hundreds of cases. They almost always started speaking about the previous life between the ages of 2 and 5. By 7 or 8, the memories would begin to fade. The details they provided were never vague. They were hyper-specific. In his strongest cases, the verification rate for specific stated details ran above 80%. Stevenson did not find this comforting. He wrote in his private journal that the data was not the problem. The problem was everything else. Born with the wound. Of all the evidence Stevenson accumulated over 4 decades, there was one category he kept returning to: the birthmark cases. In 895 documented cases, children who remembered previous lives had birthmarks or birth defects that corresponded to wounds on the body of the person they claimed to have been. In cases where Stevenson could obtain the post-mortem report of the deceased individual, the wound location and the birthmark location matched with an accuracy that medical examiners found impossible to explain through any known mechanism of fetal development. When he presented this data to his colleagues at Virginia, the room went quiet, in a way he said felt less like skepticism and more like discomfort. Nobody attacked the methodology. Nobody offered an alternative explanation. They moved on to the next item on the agenda. Stevenson sat in the conference room alone afterward and wrote one sentence in his notebook. The absence of a counter-argument is not the same as acceptance. In 1974, Stevenson documented a case in rural Turkey that he would spend the next 20 years trying to disprove. A boy named Suleiman began at age 3 describing the life of a man who had died in a neighboring village from a shotgun wound to the head. He gave the man's full name, his wife's name, the names of his 3 children, the location of a specific sum of money the man had hidden before his death. The money was found exactly where he described. The deceased man had died from a shotgun wound that entered above the right ear. Suleiman had a birthmark above his right ear that his parents had noted at birth. Stevenson spent 6 years verifying every element of this case. His conclusion was that he could find no explanation within any established scientific framework. The reaction. The scientific establishment's response to Stevenson's work followed a pattern he documented with the same clinical precision he applied to his cases. Stage 1 was ignoring it. Stage 2 was ridicule without engagement. Stage 3 was methodological objections that disappeared when he addressed them and were then replaced by new methodological objections. Stevenson responded to every objection in writing, publicly, in peer-reviewed journals. The objections kept changing. He noted that in 40 years of publishing in this field, he had never once received a substantive counter-argument that engaged with the actual data. What he received was something different. Colleagues stopped citing his other work to avoid association. Grant funding dried up in ways that had nothing to do with his methodology ratings. His own department quietly stopped listing his reincarnation research in its official publications. Here is what almost nobody understands about what Stevenson was actually arguing. He was not arguing for reincarnation. He was arguing for something far more specific and far more scientifically interesting: the existence of a mechanism by which information, including physical information, can transfer between biological lives. He wasn't asking you to believe in souls. He was asking the scientific community to explain his data using the tools it claimed to have. 2,500 cases, 40 years, 40 countries, peer-reviewed methodology, published in mainstream journals, and the scientific response was silence dressed up as skepticism.
The burial.
When Stevenson died in 2007, he left behind something his colleagues hadn't expected: a second archive. Cases he had investigated fully, verified rigorously, and then chosen not to publish. In a letter found in his private papers, he explained why. He wrote that there were cases in his files so strong, so completely without alternative explanation, that he had made a deliberate decision to withhold them, not because he doubted them, because he believed the scientific community was not yet ready to engage with them honestly. He wrote that he had spent 40 years learning the difference between evidence that challenges a worldview and evidence that simply destroys it. The first kind gets argued with. The second kind gets ignored. Those cases are still in the archive at the University of Virginia. The question this story keeps asking isn't whether reincarnation is real. The question is what we do with data we don't have a framework for. Every major shift in scientific understanding began with data that the existing framework couldn't absorb. Continental drift, germ theory, heliocentrism. Every single one was initially rejected, not because the data was weak, but because the conclusion was too disruptive. Stevenson's data has been sitting in the same waiting room for 60 years. The methodology has never been successfully challenged. The data has never been explained away. It has only ever been ignored. After Stevenson died, a researcher named Jim Tucker took over his work at Virginia. Tucker had the same training and the same methodology. He started focusing on American cases, specifically because he believed the cultural distance in Stevenson's work gave skeptics an easy exit. In 2013, he documented the case of a boy in Oklahoma named Ryan, who identified himself as a Hollywood extra from the 1930s. Ryan identified the man from a photograph in a book, a background actor with no Wikipedia page, no obituary, no easily accessible records. Tucker's team verified 55 of the specific statements Ryan made about that man's life. The man's family confirmed details Ryan knew that were not in any public record. Tucker published the case in a peer-reviewed journal in 2016. The response was identical to Stevenson's experience 50 years earlier: silence, dressed as skepticism. Ian Stevenson spent 40 years asking one question: not whether consciousness survives death, whether the tools we use to study reality are actually capable of studying all of it. The cases are still there. The methodology is still there. What isn't there is a single published scientific paper that explains them. Stevenson didn't ask you to believe anything. He just asked science to do its job. 60 years later, that job is still unfinished.